Welcome back to another edition of Exercise Physiology, spoken and broken down. Let's hit into chapter 9 here. And chapter 9 relates around stress and relates to stress reactivity, but then really stress with exercise in general. So, we are going to basically break down what stress is and then go through a little bit of the process of what is the physiological response, then the psychological response, and then kind of go from there. So let's get down to it with this section. So in the first state here, we always kind of go over, like with anxiety, we went over this as well. So what is stress? And really, if you look at it, the definition that they use within the book that we have is a state of disharmony or threatened homeostasis. Well, disharmony, things are out of, kind of out of control. Threatened homeostasis, and what that means is, when you're looking at, it is a threat to your neutral being or your level of rest or relaxation in terms of homeostasis or that normal everyday functioning. Okay. In other senses here, they talk about challenges here. What we're referring to is, if you look at the definition, what we're saying is, with stress, it's more like, I guess that, what we experience when we face challenges. So that would be a better way. So when we face challenges, how does that react within our system? So we have to look at it from the standpoint of, well, what are the stressors? Are they external or are they internal? Are they internal, meaning more about how you feel about something? Are they more about, like if you're like, you got the microphone right there and it's like, well, do you have this fear of getting up in front of people and talking? Or is it external, where it's more of like like external being more like a physical threat. All right. So if you see a bear, obviously that's going to lead you to be a little bit more stressed out than you normally would. All right. And then lastly, with stress comes a few different terms. All right, stress, as in up top here in our highlighted word, is the overall challenges that we have to overcome and how we relate to them and how we react to them. That's stress, okay? And really when we think about stress, really what we think about is distress. All right. Distress is really stressors that are thought to be negative, whereas eustress eustress is more of a stressor that is deemed to be positive, right? So, exercise, graduation, getting a promotion, all of those things, passing your test with an A, all of those things are forms of eustress. They are positive stressors. Distress, on the other hand, would be like, bombing on an exam, or you could actually be, before the exam even starts, you could think about it in terms of, is that exam causing you to have feelings of worry or doubt or whatever it may be. All right. Deadlines approaching can be distress. Okay. So that's part of it. All right. So what happens here during this whole process is we end up going through what we call the general adaptation syndrome, or GAS. Okay, and with the general adaptation syndrome, we go through a few different levels, a few different, different reactions of within our body. And the first one with general adaptation is what we would call arousal, all right, and alarm. And really, with arousal and alarm, what you're talking about is what you may have heard before in terms of getting, like really freaked out or getting hyped up, or because it can go both ways. But the fight or flight response. Okay, fight or flight response is what we call a sympathetic action, where everything becomes heightened. All right, whether it be heart rate, breathing rate, you start perspiring, whatever it may be. But fight or flight is part of that arousal or alarm. All right. Then on the end of everything, that's the physiological. Now on the behavioral side of everything, you might have tend or befriend. All right. So that's why, the fight or flight is really the overall encompassing term that you've heard before, but tend or befriend, it's a newer, I wouldn't say newer, that would be but it's a little bit less used. And, like it says, fight or flight is more about, okay, well, are you going to fight or flee? Are you going to like stand up for it or run away? With this right here, tend or befriend, So, what are we thinking about here? Are we going to, you know, come forward and react to that, tend to, the what's going on, or are we going and if we tend to it, that means we're going to react to it, or are we going to befriend it, and that's where we, start looking for like, security or comfort. Okay, you're going to work with it, or you're going to just start to enjoy it. All right, and that's where sometimes you have the different reactions, and you have these different, two different situations. All right, so that's your arousal and alarm, and it can be in different ways. All right, so what's going to happen with that arousal or alarm is you're going to start feeling, depending upon the situation, anxious. You can start feeling irritated. You can start feeling vulnerable. All right, and then what ends up happening is, like I said before, you have a sympathetic reaction. All right, and that's your arousal and alarm. And then what will end up happening is you end up with a parasympathetic reaction, which is where we start to try to get back to that relaxative state, try to push our body closer to homeostasis, which we talked about in the last slide. All right. So what happens though is that with that arousal or alarm, if it continues, if it remains, if you don't take care of it, so if it's left like unresolved, all right, what'll happen is you'll go into what we would call resistance, which is more of like a strain on the system, and that leads to things like, more worry or doubt, and then it also can lead to things like, more physiological responses like a lack of sleep, like, or you have difficulty sleeping. All right. So with that resistance, if it continues and that stressor just continues to not become resolved, what ends up happening is you come into a state of exhaustion. And that's where you get that massive amount of fatigue. You end up with, some stress-related disorder. You might end up with anxiety. You could lead to depression. And that's where we start to become sick. All right. Now, when we look at things, we could look at it almost on like, on a curved slant, where the arousal alarm spikes us up and the resistance, if it stays neutral, our body eventually will resolve it. And then what will end up happening is if you start to, as you resolve it, you start coming down off of that high of stress that you have. And then what will end up happening is end up going through exhaustion. So if we were to take and just kind of pull up the, the general adaptation syndrome here, and we just look at and we pull over an image that we might find, and this is where you can kind of see, this is a great, and if we put this right in, we can kind of get a better, and a better idea as to what we're looking at here. And this is the whole aspect of this general adaptation syndrome, where again, there's your alarm, there's your resistance, there's your exhaustion. And if you look right here on a high and a low scale, all right, stress resistance, that's that even part where we're not stressed and we're not overly stressed and we're not under stressed. We just are going through our day to day. Well, what happens is as you become, alarmed, you can see here that you have, when the stressor occurs, it starts to build up, and there's that resistance that we were talking about. It kind of builds up, builds up, builds up, builds up, and you're coping with it. Now, as you get to that exhaustion phase, what will happen here is as you come down into this exhaustion part, that's the decline. When you get to this part right here, where you get to that stress resistance and your exhaustion meets your stress resistance, what ends up happening at this point, and if we go, and I'll just kind of pull up a little, so at this point right here, where the right inside of the circle, okay, that point right there where exhaustion meets stress resistance, if your body is able to, or if you feel recovered, if you feel like that, if you got into that exhaustive state, okay, that point there is where you would then start to go, and if you follow my arrow, it'll just kind of go to the right and keep going to that stress resistance. If the body starts to decline, like in this moment here, that is where we start to get into that fatigue, that illness, that sickness, chronic bouts of like a disorder like anxiety or depression. All right, so that's what we're looking at here. Okay, and those are the things that we want to pay attention to. And that's why it's very, very important for us to kind of pay attention to those things, because the more we stay in exhaustion, the worse off we are. Right? The harder it, the harder it is on your system to be able to function or to fight off what's going on. Okay? So again, with the we talked a little bit about physiological responses and psychological responses, but what technically happens in this moment? So with a stress response, all right, it's the response of the stress, how your body reacts when encountering a real, perceived, or expected threat. Now, real, perceived, or expected, those terms are all subjective to who you are and what you're made up of in terms of your ability to cope with stress. Okay, so that really makes a big difference there. All right, a couple of major areas that really kind of get affected by the stress response are the amygdala and the hypothalamus. All right, and with those, you end up having to constantly go through these hormonal responses, whether it be releasing catecholamines and cortisol in particular. All right, and the catecholamines, if we were to kind of talk about what those are, depending upon, so during sympathetic, which is, remember we talked about, that's the heightened state, that's the fight or flight response. Sympathetic, we're talking about norepinephrine and epinephrine. All right, and then with the parasympathetic, we talk about ACH, which is also known as acetylcholine. Okay, so these three hormones are going to impact you at certain levels depending upon how heightened you are, how high norepinephrine and epinephrine get you, and this is also what we would call adrenaline. Norepinephrine, epinephrine is more adrenaline, all right, and they're basically released from the adrenal medulla, which is the adrenal gland, right, or the inner part of the adrenal gland, and then, like I said, there, with sympathetic, you have your acetylcholine. Now, the other one that was listed here is cortisol. We relate cortisol with as the stress hormone. When we stress, cortisol is released, and then you're saying to yourself, well, I thought cortisol was released when I exercise. Well, yes, it is. All right, it definitely is, and when cortisol is released, it has a different reaction within the system, and it really can cause havoc on cells. It can really cause havoc on you as a person. But in terms of exercise stress, because of all the positive that comes from the exercise component, the ability that cortisol has to hurt the system really is negated by the benefit of the exercise. The other thing that you want to be aware of is that cortisol is actually very high when you wake up in the morning. And what that means is that the body actually uses cortisol in a positive manner, because what it's doing at that point is it's basically helping your metabolism stay risen, and you can actually burn a few more calories versus waking up and eating that can cause cortisol to stop being produced and stop having its positive effect on our metabolism and cause insulin to be released, which will then cause us to start storage versus burning. All right, so just kind of some things to think about with cortisol. All right. So, we talked a little bit about, homeostasis before, but when we talk about homeostasis and allostasis, let's just kind of break those down a little bit. So homeostasis, your internal environment stays constant, okay, versus what's going on externally. So, if you have a moment where, internally you're like, nah, I'm fine, even though the world in front of your eyes is kind of just constantly moving through certain motions, you're in a homeostatic kind of a response, and that means that you're staying in equilibrium. All right. Allostasis, on the other hand, is, like it says, it's achieving stability through change. Okay, like it says, the balance of essential coping with or essential coping or using your adaptation systems. Okay, wow, I couldn't talk for a second there. And so what ends up happening is when you use your coping, when you use those adaptation systems, what ends up happening is you end up going through what we call an allostatic load. Okay, and that's the cost. Okay, so if we wanted to kind of say that, it's the cost of the coping or adaptation. Okay, it's kind of like currency for stress. All right. So if you get stressed out, all right, and you start to, try to become more stable as things change and or not get, so let's say you don't want to get overly distressed. What'll happen is you'll adapt, okay? And when you adapt, what ends up happening is you end up causing what we call the allostatic load. So your body has a load placed on it, kind of like if you were to put a barbell on your back and try to back squat. Well, if you don't have any weight on it, it's going to be pretty light. So that's a low allostatic load if we think psychologically. All right, and as we start compounding more stress onto our system, the allostatic load rises just like the weight that you're trying to back squat rises. All right, so you can kind of use that as a reference point to what allostatic load is really about. And it's really, again, how we respond to a stressful situation and how our system just becomes overworked, because if our allostatic load increases to a point that we cannot calm ourselves down, then ultimately what ends up happening is we end up getting fatigued or sick or tired, or, whatever it may be. Okay. So we got to be aware of that. And so what ends up happening here is like, okay, well, who is better off? We have to understand that in terms of like, people wise, when we talk about exercise, a person who's more unfit has this tendency to have a higher allostatic load just placed on them in general. Okay. So what we end up with is we have a hard time turning off certain stressful situations, and that really comes from here. All right. So if we looked at everything in terms of what happens, we've kind of hit on, with sympathetic and what we call hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal cortical, axis change. These are pathways for us in terms of our, when we talk about allostatic load. So with the SAM axis, or sympathetic adrenal medullary axis, what this is, with this allostatic load, is you end up having, when you become worked on, what ends up happening is the amygdala senses that things, like you're getting sensory information or visual acuity that you're seeing, and you're becoming, you start like processing everything. What ends up happening is the hypothalamus makes this response to either release a sympathetic response, like it says on the left side, where your lateral hypothalamus innervates the adrenal medullary, and that's where you get the adrenal input, where we're talking about epinephrine, norepinephrine, which we talked about before. All right. So you end up with a heightened response, whereas if as we say, the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus, what you're going to end up is releasing what we call corticotropin releasing hormones. All right. So that's, it says it stimulates the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, and it releases adrenocorticotropin hormones, or ACTHs, into the bloodstream. Therefore, you end up with the adrenal cortex releasing cortisol. All right. And at that point there, you end up having a change in the response that you really, at that point in time, you end up with, that an overly stressed body, okay, would be a good way to kind of put that. All right. So depending upon, what axis you're working within is really going to, determine, are you, if you start producing too much cortisol, what happens if you can actually produce too much epinephrine, norepinephrine, what could happen, so do we want to be able to get to our, when we release epinephrine, norepinephrine, we understand that we're going to be able to eventually relax. When we have when we have production of cortisol, we eventually want to stop producing cortisol. Well, if we have a heightened response of overproduction of cortisol, depression can end up with, people who have panic attacks or panic disorders. All right, you can end up with chronic fatigue syndrome where you're always tired. So there's a lot of negatives that can come from these pathways. All right. So really if you want to think about this, Have you ever experienced an overload of stress, and then has it ever resulted in ill health? Have you ever gotten so stressed to the point that, I don't mean like throwing up, I mean like the next day or that night you end up getting like a cold, or you start experiencing like chills or whatever it may be. And that's that's the body's response to, basically the fact that you just became sick. Okay. And like I said, another thing to think about, if so, what, if anything, were you able to do to counteract it? If you start to feel like ill, well, were you able to deep breathe, meditate? Were you able to go work out and kind of, wear off that stress? I don't know. But just kind of think of, what you might have done, because that kind of shows you where you're at in terms of homeostasis, the ability to stay within that. Or if we go back to, if we're going to think back to the picture that we saw about the general adaptation syndrome, are we at that stress resistance component? So what ends up happening is we end up coming into what we call a cross-stressor adaptation hypothesis. And it says here, the exposure to a stressor of sufficient intensity or duration, or both, causes us to adapt in a certain way, where our stress response systems adapt in a certain way, and we end up with a decreased sensitivity. And then what ends up happening is, if we use exercise training as our example, what ends up happening is you end up with two terms here that ends up happening is habituation and sensitization. All right. So what ends up happening with habituation is you end up having what we call a decreased magnitude or a decreased height of response to some challenge that you might have. All right. So if we constantly expose you to something, it will become habit forming. It becomes familiar. You don't have as much of a crazy response to it. You do not become as stressed. Okay. On the other hand, what ends up happening is you might end up with what we call sensitization. Sensitization. Sorry, I put all those syllables together. With sensitization, what ends up happening is you end up becoming sensitized. I know I'm saying it right now, but what ends up happening here is that you become, I guess the best way to put it, things that are unfamiliar to you or threatening to you do not have that same heightened reaction if you're going through sensitization. All right. So with exercise, what ends up happening is that with exercise, you become habit forming, you become habitualized, or you might end up going through habituation. With exercise, though, there isn't necessarily a sense of sensitization, because really one of the things that we have to understand is that every bout of exercise creates a new challenge, so you don't really become sensitized to it. All right, so you're always kind of in this like unknown in some way, so things are not as clear cut. All right, so you got to be aware of that. But really, what happens, as you become better at something, is it more habit forming? All right, and are you able, really at that point, what you do with with this habituation is you become more tolerant of certain situations, and it minimizes like how your body in terms of physiology reacts. And therefore you end up with a better hormone production, you end up with better hormone storage, and from there, that's where we can react better to certain stressors, because you're just natural. Okay. So let's kind of get down into, so now we're kind of in this point where now it's like, okay, we got these stressors, we understand that we can become desensitized or sensitized to them, which we'd rather be sensitized to them because it's going to create a better response in our system. All right. But what happens when we end up getting into what we call psychophysiology? All right. What we look at is how, cognitive or thoughts, emotional, our emotions, and behavioral, how we react, behavior situations, interact with our physiological events or physical, let's just say exercise, for example. All right. And so what ends up happening here is you have, okay, all of these things that are running through your head, but it's like, okay, well, what happens when you start getting anxious? What happens to your heart rate? What happens to your breathing rate? All those things matter in this moment. What happens when do you become, do you start getting twitches? Well, that means your nervous system is starting to change. All right. So what ends up happening here with psychophysiology is that we end up having, what ends up happening is we end up with these complex environments that happen. And then, like it says, it's often linked through patterns of responses and further revealed by how those patterns unfold over time. Your psychophysiology really can change as you go through many different changes within your system, but also with different responses to how you work. So the more you're exposed to things, your psychophysiology can actually change and become better suited for, a more intense environment that you might get put through. So it just depends on the situation. All right. And we always have different measures that we can go by. All right, and go from there. And here's your measurement part. Okay. So what are we saying is that we know that we have a natural response to many different areas. So let's go into the cardio part of everything, cardiovascular system, and how what we can do is we can actually determine how our body reacts both parasympathetically and sympathetically. Remember, sympathetic meaning heightened, parasympathetic meaning more relaxed. Okay. So with that, we can actually measure, like it says here, catecholamines. We talked about that. Adrenaline is, norepinephrine, epinephrine, and then acetylcholine, and then cortisol as well. All right, for that purpose. So we, and other parts of that we look at are, heart rate and breathing rate, or and blood pressure. Though, excuse me, not breathing rate. We're more thinking that's more cardiorespiratory. So we're thinking, let's think more about heart rate and blood pressure here because it's cardiovascularly. All right. So really what we want to think about is how, the heart and blood vessels really start to get challenged at that point, depending upon where you are. If you stay too heightened and too stressed, you end up, having a heart rate and blood pressure response that's spiked, and then you have to, parasympathetically react to relax. Okay, so we've got to be aware of that. All right. What we can also do with our, besides cardiovascularly, we can do what we call self-reported and see how we are on what we call a perceived stress scale. And here's another way, and this is just one way of self-reporting. Obviously, you can do things like journaling and app information to see how you felt. But I like this here because if you look at the picture, I'll kind of blow it up a little bit for you. The responses that we're looking for. So if we look at just number one in general, in this month, how often have you been upset because of something that happened unexpectedly? And we can gauge that from there. Now, self-reporting that, you can just 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4. 4 being very often, 0 meaning never. And what you end up with is, a pretty clear-cut, definitive, how many times really did things get going? So, on the other hand, if you self-report through like journaling, you may not get this as clear cut. It may be a little bit more specific in terms of the moment, but not, what, in the last month, or, how often have you felt that you were unable to control the important things in your life? You might get one instance where someone talks about it, but, is it happening more often than you think? Okay, so that's why sometimes journaling can be good for specifics, but you can match it to this self-reporting of something like a stress survey, or as a stress scale. Okay, so what are we looking at in terms of with our with research? Okay, with human exercise and basically the stress that comes from it. Well, let's see. All right, so what ends up happening here is we end up what we call the apparent paradox. Okay, so what we're saying with the apparent paradox is that exercise is a stressor, but, and this is kind of, I hit on this a little bit before, people report feeling less stress following acute exercise bouts. Okay, so again, what you're saying is that exercise stresses me out, but I feel less stressed after I work out. Okay, so it's part of that paradox. Exercise is a stressor, however, feeling less stressed in general when they are physically active as opposed to being sedentary. So the more active you are, the more stress you're putting on the body, the less stressed you still are. That's kind of interesting. All right, versus a person who's sedentary, who is going to be more stressed in general if they have stress on their system because they're not providing a stimulus. Okay? And then lastly, exercise is a stressor. However, exercise yields relief to psychosocial stressors. So not only is it helping you feel less stress, it's more of a way of relief. So when you hear people say, I'm going to go, lift some weights and kind of de-stress a little bit, well, it works, and research has proven that it works, all right? So don't be afraid that if you're a stressed person, that exercise is going to hurt you. It's actually potentially going to help you, all right? So when we talk about areas, all right, we talk about cardiovascular fitness areas that we've seen. We've talked about the HPA axis a little bit, but the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal cortical axis response, and that goes to how we produce, and if you remember, that's how we produce cortisol. Okay. Immunity, all right, talking about our immune system, all right. These are all ways that, if that if you become overly stressed, your immune function really takes a, your immune system really takes a hit. All right. We know that even when you exercise, your immune system takes a hit. And that's why recovery is optimal for you in that sense. But, okay, that's great. But why is it that exercise doesn't drive our immune system crazy when we're stressed? It's because we end up having these responses with the exercise that we have. And really what ends up happening is your immune system just becomes heightened because it's able to recover better, even help you with stress and recovering better. All right. So that's always a great response to have. All right. And then because of your immune system working correctly, you end up being, you don't end up with like inflammation. You don't end up with a higher illness or disease, potential. All right. And then another thing that's been, talked about is what we call reactivity versus recovery. All right. So when we talk about things like reactivity, or reacting to something, all right, we end up, with exercise, there's just different ways that we react. And, how does our heart rate react to a situation? Well, if we're in a stressful situation and we're more exercise, we have this tendency to potentially not become as heightened in terms of our heart rate response versus somebody who potentially is unfit, right? Or with reactivity, the stress response may not create as long of a response as it would if you were unfit. And then recovery is, we all know about recovery, but understanding that, recovery is that how we get back to homeostasis. Well, the more fit we are, the more apt we are to recover quicker, and we don't attack the system as long. Okay? And then we end up with something that we call physiological toughness. Okay? And with physiological toughness, we're looking at, different aspects of, really it's just with toughness, we're talking about the ability to not have the effects of stress really just bear down on us. Okay? And how we are able to just not feel as though we can feel like we can recover more from stressors. All right. So that's kind of what we're looking at there, but let's kind of break them down a little bit in terms of, cardiovascular fitness. There is mixed evidence whether, it's a stress buffering, but, on case study basis, like people that I've worked with, they tell me that if they go out on a run, they feel like their heart rate, they feel like, their blood pressure reaction is okay. I think this is more on a case-to-case basis more than anything, very much more subjective. Okay. With the HPA axis response, we know that we can reduce cortisol response, which we were kind of talking about before, and that's more in the fit population. All right. And so because of that, what ends up happening is, remember we talked about that cross-stressor adaptation? Well, yeah, if we go back and look at it, again, it's habituation and sensitization. So if we're able to become more habit forming, cortisol doesn't allow itself to be as harmful. And sensitization, what we're talking about is, basically, you're being sensitized to it. So cortisol increases, but your body just naturally goes back and puts, and kind of relieves from that cortisol state. Okay. With immunity, again, with exposure to a stressor like exercise, we can have a positive effect on the immune system, or we can actually have a negative effect. But really, if it's exercise, we know that it's more of a positive effect where the immune system, it takes a toll on it for a little bit, but it ends up recovering better in those more. And then we talked about with inflammation, with fitness, we know that inflammatory responses are there, but the inflammatory responses to stress decrease because, again, we're just getting better adapted. There's better adaptation. Okay. So here what we end up calling, we have this what we call HIV-1. Exercise training helped to reduce the stressful influence of a real life stressor to, if you are a person who worked out, when people were alerted of HIV in their system, they actually were really not as stressed. I mean, they may have had bouts of anxiety and depression, but they bounced back because they were able to, it just really, they were able to adapt to the situation better and understand it. And then, because of that, it's a real life stressor, it reduced how they felt. So it's really kind of crazy how something like that, that bearing on your system really could be negated to a sense simply because exercise was present. There's reactivity versus recovery. All right. We know that, again, rapid recovery is, it's there. Our body is so used to fighting, off stress from exercise that, stress in real life situations is not, we can recover from it quicker. But again, one of the things that's being said with research is that we need more research attention to that. So again, we know that, everything is always ever changing, but we understand that, that there can be positives and we can recover more, and reactivity can be enhanced. It just depends on more research to show us that it's true and how we can take care of that and to help our people. Okay. So with that physical toughness, what we talked about, again, exercise reduces the immediate effects of stress. We got that. All right. It enhances our recovery. We talked about that. But what we're understanding here is that, like it says, intermittent but regular exposure to stressors can lead to psychological coping and emotional stability, and we become more tough. So if we end up with different stressors that are exposed to us, we can cope better and we can become more stable or stay more stable during those stressful moments. Well, that's exercise to a T, because with exercise we know that it's a stressor, but we can cope with it and react to it and stay more stable. But what we can also do is we can stay more, more stable and cope better in non-exercise environments as well. So what ends up making us, a little bit better in terms of the physical toughness is that we have a better catecholamine capacity. We talked about that. We know that more, there's more adrenaline and more acetylcholine that can help us with our CNS or our central nervous system to react accordingly. All right. We have reduced levels of resting catecholamines in our periphery, which means that we're not staying excited in the periphery, meaning that we're not staying elevated and heightened. All right. But we also have better responsiveness, meaning that when something happens, we respond better, which is great. And that's how we can stay more physically tough. And then, like it says here, there's a fairly rapid dissipation. So what ends up happening is that you have a dissipation of these catecholamines and you don't stay heightened and you end up recovering better. So then, like it says there, there's a delayed or reduced basal HPA axis response, which means that cortisol is going to either be delayed or reduced in the amount that it's going to be produced. That means that you're just going to feel better, you're going to recover better, you're going to act better, and that's why we become more physically tough. That's why we can push farther every new bout of exercise or whatever it may be. Okay? So then what do we got to do? Again, be careful of people's stressors. Plan your exercises when it's, when it's better for them to manage stress. And a lot of times what ends up happening is people tend to have a good idea as to when, to work out and what feels good for them, people like to work out first thing in the morning because it wakes them up, it makes them feel better, and it makes them feel better throughout the day. And people say they feel less stressed throughout the day. Other people like to go through their day and kind of work out their stress, you know. So it just depends on what you're looking for. And every person's going to be different, and every person is going to appreciate the exercise, for when it is, and eventually they may adapt to a different time or setting, and that just helps again with that stress response. Okay. So this is chapter 9. Stress is a really crazy thing, but it's really good to kind of understand what happens during those processes. All right. So again, this is the first of week 3 for us. So let's keep bearing in. We got 2 more chapters, 10 and 11, and we'll go from there. Have a great day, everyone.